A single candle flickered against the walls of the Forsyth homestead, casting grotesque shadows over an infant's crib. Outside, the wind carried whispers of mourning yet unborn. From that night onward, the town would never speak of joy without fear, for one child's existence would seed a century of silent funerals. In the bitter winter of 1845, the Forsyth family welcomed a child whose very presence seemed to warp the air around him. The infant's first cries echoed strangely through the cold wooden walls of the homestead, carrying a resonance that unsettled even the most composed servants. Abigail Forsyth, mother and gentle soul, held him close, yet she felt a chill descend that no fire could chase away. Jacob Forsyth, the stern father, masked his unease with rigid control, but his eyes betrayed the silent fear he could not speak. Neighbors whispered immediately of something unnatural. The child's dark, unblinking eyes seemed to carry knowledge far beyond his days, reflecting a mind older, colder, more calculating than any infant should possess. The air in the house grew oppressive. Doors creaked, though no one had moved them. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floors and walls, bending toward the child as if drawn by invisible gravity. The family dog refused to approach, growling at unseen forms, ears flattened in terror. One morning the cat vanished without a trace, leaving a streak of black fur across the frozen floor, as if it had been pulled into another realm. The midwife, pale and trembling, confessed to neighbors that she felt a malevolent presence descend the moment he was born, a chill that reached her bones and would not leave. Servants began to flee, claiming they saw the child in places he could not have been, or heard whispers of names and events yet to occur. Farmhands refused to enter the house after dusk, insisting that some force watched from corners, intangible but suffocating. Even the wind seemed different around the Forsyth home, carrying faint echoes of cries and whispers that disappeared when one tried to focus on them. Neighbors claimed the child's shadow moved independently, stretching beyond the limits of his small body. By the week's end, the town had begun to notice a pattern. Those who passed the Forsyth property reported a sense of being watched, a creeping unease that followed them home. The first minor deaths occurred. Livestock sickened inexplicably, a small child fell gravely ill, and old Mrs. Turner succumbed quietly to a sudden, unexplainable fever. Silent funerals began, funerals without wailing or words, and the town's fear solidified into superstition. Abigail and Jacob clung to each other, yet even their union could not stave off the growing dread. From the moment of his birth, it became clear to some that the Forsyth child was no ordinary infant. A presence dark and inevitable had entered the town, bending shadows, whispering in the winds, and leaving behind a trail of silence and fear. Imagine this was your family. What would you have done? Spring of 1845 brought Forsyth its first death connected to the child. Eliza Turner, an elderly widow, passed quietly in her home. There was no wind, no birdsong, no sound of life. Only the hushed, deliberate movements of mourners as they processed through the village, faces pale and blank, hearts heavy with an unspoken dread. The coffin, draped in white, seemed impossibly heavy, pressing down as if the earth itself conspired to weigh it into the ground. Even the church bells, when rung, emitted a hollow, trembling tone, vibrating with a frequency that unnerved those who listened. Jacob Forsyth attended, stoic yet visibly pale, standing rigidly at the edge of the procession. Abigail clutched her infant son close, whispering prayers that felt fragile against the overwhelming stillness. No one dared speak above a whisper. Those present described a strange tension in the air, as if time itself had slowed, pressing down with invisible weight. Children who watched the funeral were silent for days afterward, staring at corners and shadows, muttering words they did not understand, eyes wide with unexplained fear. Neighbors later reported faint infant cries carried on the wind during the ceremony, though the Forsyth child had remained in his nursery, unobserved and unmoved. The town debated the meaning of these events, yet no conclusion could pierce the veil of uncertainty. Some whispered of divine judgment, others of unnatural forces tied to the Forsyth family. Servants refused to speak of what they had seen, but one described the sensation of cold fingers brushing along the spine, an invisible presence brushing against the living. The funeral set a precedent. Within weeks, additional deaths followed similar patterns, quiet, unexplainable, and increasingly linked to the Forsyth home. The first silent funeral was no longer an isolated tragedy. It became a signal of something larger, something invisible but pervasive, shaping the town's collective fear. The town's leaders, fearing unrest, attempted to rationalize what they could, insisting that disease or coincidence was responsible. But rational explanations faltered under the mounting evidence. Livestock perished without illness, animals refused to approach the property, and travelers passing by reported fleeting glimpses of a pale child's shadow in places it could not exist. The whispers of the wind grew louder, more insistent, often echoing the child's name, calling to the hearts of those who dared to listen. By the close of the funeral, it was impossible for the people of Forsyth to deny what they felt. Something otherworldly had entered their lives, a silent and unyielding force. Silent funerals would become a recurring pattern, a grim testament to the influence radiating from the Forsyth home. Fear had begun to shape the very rhythm of life in the town. Tell me in the comments, do you believe this was fate or something darker? By the summer of 1845, Forsyth had grown painfully accustomed to the whispers carried by the wind. Villagers swore they heard the child's name murmured softly, floating through streets and fields even when no one was near. The air around the Forsyth homestead seemed heavier, viscous, as though shadow itself had substance. Livestock refused to graze near the property. Horses would rear without cause, eyes rolling, ears flat, sensing something invisible yet horrifyingly present. Even the family dog would growl at empty corners, hackles raised, yet never the child himself. Abigail Forsyth noticed the intensity of her son's gaze, fixed upon empty spaces in the home as if he were reading unseen lines of reality. Floors creaked beneath invisible weight, doors moved slightly when no one was near. One evening, a traveling merchant passing the property noted his wagon wheels shuddering violently along a smooth road. He swore that shadows outside the windows stretched unnaturally toward the child, reaching as though drawn by his presence. By that time, the town had begun keeping vigil at night, watching, listening, terrified of what might appear in the darkness. On a night in late July, the church bell rang without human touch. Its echo rippled through the village with a hollow resonance that drained warmth from the air. Congregants rushed to the steeple, finding no one had climbed the tower. The bells tolling left them shivering in dread, their faces pale and eyes wide. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, afraid to speak too loudly, for fear that even sound might awaken the unnatural. Jacob Forsyth, meanwhile, recorded each occurrence in his private journals, growing increasingly obsessed with mapping every incident, every death, and every strange event connected to his son. Then came the disappearance of the cowherd, last seen walking across the fields before sunset. By dawn, his hat rested, atop a fence post, rocking in the wind as though the man had been lifted and vanished into nothing. The townspeople could not rationalize the events. Fear of the child, though unspoken, became nearly universal. Shadows moved independently. Strange sounds came from empty rooms, and the air itself seemed thickened by anticipation. Abigail began to realize the pattern. The child's presence was not merely unsettling, it was actively shaping reality, bending the natural world around him. From that day, whispers in the wind were no longer dismissed as superstition. Travelers told of eerie sounds on roads near the property, footsteps that followed, cries echoing from empty fields, and shadows that slithered unnaturally. The town understood one truth. The Forsyth child was more than a boy. He was a harbinger, a catalyst of dread whose presence would forever alter Forsyth. Would you have dared walk past the Forsyth home that night, knowing the wind might carry your name, Jacob Forsyth? A man known for his stern demeanor and precise habits soon became consumed by an obsession he could neither name nor resist. Nights were spent hunched over a desk in the corner of his dimly lit study, writing feverishly in journals hidden beneath the floorboards. Each page recorded the strange occurrences surrounding his son, deaths, whispers, shadows that moved without cause, and objects that shifted as though guided by invisible hands. The entries grew increasingly erratic, sentences breaking apart under the weight of terror. Some lines were almost illegible, scrawled in trembling ink, yet certain passages struck with chilling clarity. The child commands shadows. He does not cry without reason. Death listens when he moves. Abigail Forsyth discovered one of these journals by accident, buried beneath loose floorboards near the hearth. The words inside revealed a meticulous account of every silent hour at funeral, every sudden illness, and every inexplicable disappearance in the town since the child's birth. Jacob refused to discuss the journals, muttering only that they were for the safety of the family. But the truth was clear. His obsession was both protective and paranoid, a futile attempt to understand forces beyond human comprehension. Servants fled one by one, whispering that they had seen the child reflected in mirrors where none should exist, his gaze unsettling, his silence commanding. Jacob noted the appearance of strange scratches along walls and floorboards, shapes resembling hands, always pointing toward the child's room. Candles flickered violently when he entered the nursery, and books fell from shelves without reason. Even he could no longer deny that something unnatural lived within the boy. Scholars consulted him briefly, dismissed after recording the frantic observations in their own handwriting. The child's influence, it seemed, extended beyond the homestead, touching anyone who dared approach. The town grew quieter, its streets emptier at night, its residents whispering prayers and crossing themselves when near the property. Despite the mounting evidence, Jacob maintained his vigilance. He attempted charms, prayers, and protective rituals, though his journals reveal a growing despair. Nothing seemed to shield them from what watched. Abigail, reading these passages, recognized that the child was not merely an infant. He was something else, something deliberate, observing and shaping the world with an intelligence both alien and inexorably human. Fear had taken hold of the Forsyth family, isolating them physically and emotionally. Their home, once warm and familiar, now felt like a cage, its walls thick with dread and shadows. By midsummer, the town had begun to whisper openly of the Forsyth curse. Neighbors avoided the property, children refused to pass it, and travelers passing through reported faint, haunting sounds echoing through the air. Jacob's journals became a testament not to the boy's innocence, but to the inevitability of what the Forsyth family had brought upon themselves. Something dark had entered their lives, something unstoppable, and Jacob, though obsessed, understood that knowledge alone could not protect them. The shadows that moved toward the child were patient, and patience, it seemed, would demand its toll. Old man Harlan, who lived across the creek from the Forsyth home, became one of the first outside observers to confront the child's strange influence. On a bitter evening in late summer, he claimed to see the boy standing barefoot in the snow, arms raised toward the pale moon, murmuring words that made the very air tremble. Harlan's daughter, peeking through a shutter, fainted, her small body collapsing onto the frozen floor. By the time Harlan approached, the child had vanished, yet the snow revealed spiraling footprints that led deep into the woods and then simply ended, as though the earth itself had swallowed him. Harlan swore that the boy's eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, reflecting an inner darkness that chilled the blood. Other villagers began to corroborate similar experiences. Shadows moved independently along the streets, strange murmurs floated across empty fields, and the scent of iron, sharp and unnerving, seemed to radiate from the Forsyth home. Travelers passing through the town reported hearing soft, unintelligible cries and seeing fleeting glimpses of a small figure disappearing behind trees or walls where none should have been. Even the animals, instinctively aware, refused to graze near the creek and shied away from the property, their terror undeniable. Harlan's story became a cornerstone of local folklore. Families gathered in hushed circles at night, recounting sightings of the boy, his silent movements, and the unnatural way shadows seemed to cling to him. Some hordes ascribed the sensation of being watched, of shadows slithering just out of sight, of a presence that weighed heavily on the chest even in open air. Travelers who reported these events were often dismissed, but those who lived nearby knew the truth. There was something inexplicable about the Forsyth child, something that stretched beyond superstition into tangible dread. The Forsyths themselves, particularly Abigail, observed these tales with growing concern. Though she maintained the innocence of her child, she could not deny the mounting evidence. She noticed how the boy would stare at empty corners, tracking shadows only he seemed to perceive. He moved with a stillness and awareness that unsettled even Jacob, whose stern rationality had long been a shield against fear. As these stories spread, the child became the unspoken epicenter of unease, a catalyst for events the town could not rationalize. By late autumn, the town had begun to speak openly of the Forsyth curse. The child was no longer a simple infant. He had become a harbinger, a figure whose silent influence affected not only his home but the surrounding woods, roads, and fields. Shadows bent unnaturally, whispers followed travelers, and the earth itself seemed attuned to his presence. Residents crossed themselves when passing the creek, fearing the boy's gaze. The Forsyth child was now a living legend of dread. Would you have dared approach the house after dark, knowing what the neighbors had seen? The first visitor to suffer under the Forsyth child's influence was Dr. Elias Monroe, a traveling physician known for his skepticism and rational mind. He arrived in Forsyth believing that science could explain all, that superstition was the refuge of the timid. On his second night in the Forsyth home, however, all certainty vanished. He awoke to find the child standing silently at the foot of his bed, eyes fixed, and unblinking small hands folded with a precision that unnerved him. The room was unnaturally cold. The air thickened as if weighed by invisible pressure. He tried to speak, but no sound formed. His voice seemed absorbed by the very walls. By dawn, Dr. Monroe was found pale and unresponsive, clutching his notebook. The pages were smeared with frantic writing, words he did not remember inscribing. Town authorities examined him, finding no signs of injury or disease. Only terror remained, etched deep into his expression. Whispers in the village spread quickly, cementing the child's growing reputation. This infant, silent and motionless in many moments, could exert influence far beyond human understanding. Abigail Forsyth, witnessing Dr. Monroe's state, felt a cold dread descend upon her that no hearth or candle could alleviate. Jacob Forsyth, though equally terrified, continued his nightly journaling, documenting each strange occurrence with obsessive detail, seeking patterns, seeking control, yet finding none. The townspeople, once hesitant to connect the Forsyth home with misfortune, now whispered openly of the child's ability to affect strangers. Dr. Monroe's death became the first undeniable record of an outsider succumbing to invisible forces emanating from the house. Visitors avoided the town entirely. Rumors traveled along the roads, warning travelers to steer clear of the Forsyth property. Even those who had once dismissed superstition began to acknowledge the child's unnerving presence. Animals became unreliable companions. Horses refused to pull carts near the house. Dogs growled at empty corners and cats fled without cause. Objects moved inexplicably within the Forsyth home. Books fallen from shelves, chairs shifted, doors ajar without human intervention. Shadows appeared to bend toward the child, and faint whispers, repeating the doctor's name, followed through empty corridors. By the following week, the town had become paralyzed by fear. The death of Dr. Monroe, a rational man of science, validated every whispered rumor. The Forsyth child was no ordinary infant. He had become a focal point of terror, a catalyst whose presence reshaped the town itself. Abigail and Jacob, though determined to protect their son, were now acutely aware that his influence extended beyond their home, touching minds, hearts, and bodies in ways neither parent could control. From that moment, it was impossible for anyone in Forsyth to ignore the truth. The child brought something dark, inevitable, and terrifying with him, a force that would claim all who came too near. Would you have dared stay in the house knowing what had happened to the doctor? Jacob Forsyth's journals became the family's grim record, a meticulous account of events that no human mind could easily comprehend. He documented the child's strange behaviors, noting instances where shadows twisted unnaturally toward him, objects shifted without touch, and whispers floated through rooms when no one else was present. Each page conveyed increasing terror, scribbled in ink that trembled with fear. Abigail discovered these writings hidden beneath floorboards, their words chillingly precise. He does not cry without reason. He observes the living. Death and silence follow his gaze. The journals chronicled each silent funeral, each disappearance, each inexplicable tremor shaking the town streets. Jacob wrote of the child staring for hours into empty corners, his small body rigid yet intensely aware. Candles flickered violently when he entered a room. Floorboards groaned under weight that could not exist. He recorded the frightened flight of servants, some screaming at shadows no one else could see. Even animals avoided the house, refusing to approach, barking and hissing at invisible threats. The boy's influence extended beyond walls, touching neighbors and travelers alike. Bullbent. Igael read in horror as Jacob noted incidents too unsettling to speak aloud. A traveler's horse collapsed inexplicably. Neighboring infant fell gravely ill after passing the Forsyth property. Shadows seemed to gather around the child, following him through corridors, concentrating near windows. Jacob attempted charms and prayers, recording them meticulously, yet he admitted their ineffectiveness. He confessed that nothing shields us from what watches. The family's fear deepened as they recognized patterns, sudden deaths, silent mornings, and the child's unblinking gaze intertwined as though part of some larger design. The journals also documented interactions with outsiders. Dr. Monroe's death was recorded in chilling detail. The doctor's voice silenced, his body pale, his notebook smeared with words he could not remember writing. Jacob wrote that the child's influence was deliberate, almost intelligent, shaping reality subtly, yet with relentless inevitability. Abigail realized that their son was no ordinary infant. He was a force that defied understanding, a catalyst whose presence distorted everything nearby. The townspeople grew wary. Villagers avoided roads near the Forsyth home, children refused to pass, and travelers recounted fleeting glimpses of a small figure vanishing behind trees or walls. Shadows slithered unnaturally, and whispers accompanied them. The journals, though private, became a testament to the child's inexorable power, a record of dread extending from a single home into the wider town. By autumn, Abigail understood the truth. Their child was at once innocent in appearance and terrifying in influence. Jacob's journals served as both warning and confession, documenting events no one could stop, no one could explain. The Forsyth child had become the epicenter of fear, and those who encountered him were forever changed. Imagine living with such inevitability every day. How long before fear itself consumed you? In the autumn of 1845, Thomas Miller, a local miller Canaan, known for his curiosity and disregard for superstition, approached the Forsyth home with a sense of bravado. He had heard the whispers, the rumors of strange occurrences, and yet believed the tales exaggerated. On the first evening of his visit, he reported feeling a chill that seemed to seep into his bones, unrelieved even by the fire. The child's gaze, small and unblinking, followed him relentlessly, and shadows in the room stretched toward him unnaturally, twisting along walls and floorboards. Miller attempted conversation with Jacob Forsyth, but the father appeared tense, restless, his eyes constantly darting toward the nursery door. Abigail Forsyth held the child close, sensing that his presence was affecting the visitor in ways words could not capture. As night fell, Miller's unease grew. Candles flickered violently. Furniture shifted imperceptibly, yet enough to disturb his balance. Whispering sounds echoed in the room, soft, unintelligible, yet unmistakably deliberate, as if the air itself carried a warning. Miller laughed nervously, attempting to mask his terror, but he could not escape the sensation of being observed by something not entirely human. By midnight, Miller had ventured into the hallway to inspect a strange noise. He never returned. Servants found only his hat resting neatly atop the staircase railing, spinning slowly, as if someone had placed it there with deliberate care. No footprints led away from the house. The snow outside remained undisturbed. The town, alerted by frantic messages, gathered at dawn only to find the Forsyth home seemingly untouched, the child asleep in his crib as if unaware of the vanished man. Whispers spread quickly. The child's influence was no longer limited to the home. It had claimed another life without bloodshed or violence, leaving only terror and unanswered questions. Neighbors reported strange phenomena following Miller's disappearance. Dogs refused to enter fields near the Forsyth property, crops wilted overnight, and a faint metallic scent hung in the air for days. Travelers passing through recounted seeing a small figure vanish into the shadows, leaving behind echoes of laughter or faint cries. The town, already wary, was now gripped by fear that bordered on panic. Jacob Forsyth, documenting the disappearance in his journals, noted that even a man of reason could fall victim to the child's unearthly presence. Abigail, torn between maternal instinct and dread, recognized that their son's influence extended beyond their control, touching minds and hearts, bending reality itself. By mid-October, the story of Thomas Miller's disappearance was firmly entrenched in local law. The Forsyth child had become a living legend, a force that altered perception and reality simultaneously. The town understood a new, chilling truth. Anyone who approached the Forsyth home risked being claimed by something beyond comprehension. Would you have dared to step inside that house knowing what had happened to the Miller? By late 1845, the area surrounding the Forsyth home, particularly the creek that ran through their land, had become a locus of dread. Villagers who once fished or traveled along its banks began avoiding it altogether, whispering of shadows that moved against the flow of the water and strange noises that echoed without source. Children claimed to see small figures darting through the underbrush, figures that vanished when approached. The creek, once a place of life and sustenance, now held the weight of unspoken fear, the water's surface reflecting distorted images that no eye should witness. Jacob Forsyth observed these changes with a growing sense of helplessness. Each evening he recorded sightings of movement in the reeds, the soft patter of footsteps where none could be, and fleeting glimpses of dark shapes with glowing eyes lingering near the water's edge. Abigail noticed that the child, though confined to his nursery during the sea hours, would sometimes cry inexplicably at sunset, as if sensing events unfolding from a distance. Livestock refused to drink from the creek, and animals huddled together, their instincts screaming warning of unseen predators. One particularly cold evening, a traveler named Jonathan Price camped near the creek, unaware of its growing reputation. That night, he reported a thick, almost tangible mist rising from the water, carrying with it the faint sound of a child's laughter and the creak of unseen limbs moving through the trees. When he attempted to investigate, the fog thickened and seemed to part for him, guiding him closer to the Forsyth property. The next morning, Price was found disoriented at the edge of the woods, claiming he had seen the child standing silently at the water's edge, eyes glinting with a light that was neither candle nor sun. He refused to speak further of what he saw, muttering only that the shadows listened and followed. The town took note, recognizing the pattern. Each disappearance, each terrifying sighting was tied not only to the child but to the land surrounding the Forsyth home. The creek, once a simple boundary, had become a stage for the child's mysterious influence. Residents spoke in hushed tones of unnatural movements, whispers carried on the wind, and shadows that did not align with the sun. Even at noon, a villager passing the creek could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them. By winter, the creek had earned a fearful reputation. A place where shadows moved with will, where the air vibrated with whispers, and where the Forsyth child's presence seemed to extend beyond the home itself. Fear had woven itself into the landscape, and no one who lived nearby could approach without feeling the creeping inevitability of something unseen. Would you have dared walk the banks of that creek, knowing what others had seen? Several. Weeks after Thomas Miller's disappearance, a young traveling scribe named William Crowley arrived in Forsyth. Crowley, a meticulous observer and chronicler of local events, had heard tales of the Forsyth child and resolved to record them firsthand. Unlike previous visitors, he carried a journal and ink, determined to remain detached and rational. Yet from the moment he approached the Forsyth property, a chill settled over him, sharp and persistent, as if the very air resisted his presence. The first evening, Crowley documented the unsettling quiet around the homestead. Animals fled, the wind whispered unintelligible phrases, and shadows seemed unnaturally long, stretching across fields and walls. Within the house, the child stared at him with those unblinking eyes, following Crowley's every movement with uncanny precision. Candles flickered violently in response to minor gestures. Floorboards groaned under weight that could not exist. The scribe wrote in growing unease, the ink blotting and smearing, as if the room itself sought to distort his words. On the second night, Crowley witnessed events that defied explanation. Objects moved independently, chairs tilting as though pushed by invisible hands. Faint murmurs echoed in empty corridors, repeating his name softly, persistently, almost like a chant. The child remained still, yet the house's atmosphere seemed to respond to his presence alone. Crowley recorded everything with meticulous detail, noting the child's influence extended beyond mere observation. The house itself appeared alive, bending perception, twisting shadows, and drawing the scribe deeper into fear. Crowley's journal became both testimony and warning. He described the weight of the child's gaze, the subtle shifts in air and light, and the almost intelligent movements of shadow and sound around the Forsyth home. He noted how neighbors avoided the property, how animals refused proximity, and how travelers passed with an unspoken urgency, sensing the presence of something beyond comprehension. The scribe remarked that the child's influence was deliberate, extending beyond the house to the surrounding fields, the creek, and even the village itself. By the final entries, Crowley's handwriting faltered, words overlapping, sentences incomplete. He recounted visions of the child standing at the edge of shadows, observing and commanding events beyond mortal understanding. The scribe's final note, barely legible, read, "I do not know if he is child, spirit, or force, but I know that nothing I witness can undo what follows him." The journal was later found in Crowley's abandoned quarters, the ink faint but legible, a chilling record of someone who dared witness the Forsyth child's full power. The townspeople, upon reading Crowley's journal, realized the child's influence was no accident or superstition. It was deliberate, inevitable, and terrifyingly real. Tell me in the comments, would you have dared stay in Forsyth to witness it yourself? By winter of 1845, the Forsyth property exhibited phenomena that defied all understanding. Villagers began speaking of blue flames flickering at the windows at night, silent and ethereal, casting eerie light across the snow-covered ground. The flames did not illuminate the rooms within. Instead, they hovered just beyond, pulsating as if alive, moving with intent. Those brave enough to approach reported a sudden suffocating cold, a heaviness in the chest, and whispers carried on the wind, calling names no one present had spoken. Jacob Forsyth recorded the first sighting meticulously. He noted that the flames appeared only when the child was asleep or resting quietly in his nursery. They seemed to trace patterns across the walls and roof, forming shapes that resembled human figures or creatures with limbs extended toward the forest. Abigail, clutching the infant, observed the spectral light and felt an inexplicable dread. Her maternal instinct told her the child was not aware of the flames, yet their presence was undeniably linked to him. Servants refused to approach the windows. After nightfall, claiming the light itself seemed to watch them, an invisible eye judging their presence. Travelers passing the Forsyth property reported blue flames dancing across the roof lines from a distance. Horses shied violently, dogs barked at empty air. The phenomenon persisted for hours, only to vanish as abruptly as it appeared. No fire or reflective surface explained the light. Shadows twisted in impossible directions, and the frost on the ground formed unusual swirling patterns, as if the cold itself responded to an unseen influence. The townspeople began to connect the flames with the recent series of disappearances and deaths. Every silent funeral, every whispered warning, and now the blue flames, all were linked to the child. Some suggested the lights were omens, a warning to stay away, while others claimed they were manifestations of the child's growing power over the material world. Jacob noted that attempts to rationalize the flames failed utterly. Even candlelight within the home reacted unpredictably, flaring and sputtering as if intimidated by the otherworldly illumination. Abigail, increasingly fearful, recorded her own observations. She described the sensation of being drawn into the flame's light, a tug at the mind that left one trembling and unsteady. She felt the child's presence anchoring the phenomenon, a quiet, powerful energy radiating outward, bending the house, the trees, and even the frozen creek toward an inevitable, unspoken conclusion. By the end of winter, the town regarded the Forsyth property as cursed, a locus of dread that could be seen from miles away. The blue flames became a symbol of the child's power, silent, undeniable, and terrifying. Would you have dared approach that light in the dead of night? By early 1846, Forsyth's air had thickened with fear. Villagers reported hearing whispers carried on the wind, soft, unintelligible, yet unmistakably deliberate. These whispers seemed to emanate from the Forsyth home itself, yet no mouth, no living creature could be seen producing them. Some described them as fragmented phrases, fragments of names, locations, and events that had yet to occur. Others reported the whispering echoing their own fears, their guilt, their private thoughts, as though the child's influence extended into their minds. Jacob Forsyth noted the earliest instances in his journals. While the child slept quietly, the house seemed to pulse with unseen energy. Doors rattled softly, curtains swayed without draft, and floorboards creaked under weight that could not exist. Abigail noticed shadows moving independently, clinging to walls, bending corners, yet always pointing subtly toward the nursery. At night, the whispers intensified. Residents standing near the property claimed they could hear the softest murmurs, voices forming syllables almost recognizable but never fully coherent. Travelers avoided the area entirely. One merchant passing late in the evening swore that the whispers spoke his name, recounting secrets he had never told another soul. Terrified, he abandoned his wagon, fleeing into the forest. Animals too reacted to the whispers. Horses refused to pull carts near the Forsyth home. Dogs growled at nothing and cats vanished for days at a time, returning shaken and disoriented. The child's silent observation seemed to direct these events, an invisible force radiating outward, affecting every living being nearby. Abigail, torn between maternal instinct and terror, began to dread her son's silent presence. Though he remained innocent in appearance, she could feel a growing power in him that seemed to manipulate reality itself. Jacob, increasingly obsessed with documenting the phenomenon, recorded every whisper, every movement, and every shadow in painstaking detail. He observed patterns. The whispers were not random, they followed events, seeming to anticipate accidents, illnesses, and deaths. By the time winter ended, the town recognized that these silent murmurs were more than superstition. They were warnings, premonitions, and perhaps a subtle means of control exerted by the child. By spring, the village avoided the Forsyth property entirely after sunset. Even the bravest of men hesitated to approach, listening instead for the whispers that carried across the fields. It was as if the air itself had become an extension of the child's presence, stretching beyond walls and fences, infiltrating minds, bending perception. The Forsyth home was no longer just a house. It had become a locus of fear, a living entity in league with the child's growing power. Would you have dared linger near those whispers, knowing they could reach inside your mind? By mid-1846, the Forsyth household was plagued by more than whispers and shadows. It became a place of disappearance. Servants who had worked diligently within the home began vanishing without a trace. One by one, they would leave chores unfinished, meals half-prepared, only to be discovered missing hours later. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, no explanation, only a lingering cold and a palpable tension that clung to the walls. The first to vanish was Mary Thompson, a young maid whose cheerful demeanor had masked a growing unease. Jacob Forsyth had observed her discomfort, noting her reluctance to enter certain rooms, particularly the nursery. One morning, the house awoke to the absence of Mary. Her bed remained untouched, her belongings neatly arranged, yet she was gone. Abigail Forsyth searched frantically, calling her name, shaking the child in her arms to ensure he had not somehow drawn her away. But there was no answer. The town authorities were summoned, but no clues were found. Over the following weeks, other servants disappeared similarly. Laundry left mid-fold, floors swept incompletely, and meals left to spoil. Witnesses reported seeing fleeting shadows at the edges of their vision, movement that seemed to follow the servants, or faint laughter that chilled them to the bone. Jacob documented these events meticulously, growing increasingly obsessed with identifying a pattern. He noticed that each disappearance coincided with the child's periods of intense stillness and observation, as though his unblinking gaze commanded obedience from forces unseen. Abigail, torn between fear and maternal love, could not ignore the mounting evidence. The child, though still an infant, seemed to exert a quiet, unstoppable influence over the household. Animals shied away from rooms where servants vanished, floors creaked and groaned as if mourning their absence. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, warning travelers to stay clear of the Forsyth home. Whispers spread that the child's power extended beyond sight and sound, capable of drawing individuals into an invisible realm from which they might never return. By late summer, the Forsyth house stood nearly empty, save for the family and a handful of terrified servants. Fear had become the law of the home and silence its constant companion. Shadows moved independently, whispers carried through walls, and every disappearance added weight to the growing legend. The vanishing servants confirmed the town's worst fears. The child was no ordinary infant. His presence demanded control, bending reality to his quiet, inevitable will. Would you have dared remain in that house, knowing what had happened to those who served it? By the winter of 1846, the fields surrounding the Forsyth homestead had taken on a sinister quality. Snow lay in unnatural drifts, frozen in odd patterns that seemed almost deliberate, forming swirls and lines unlike anything caused by wind. Villagers who had once crossed these fields to reach neighboring farms now avoided too. Whispering of frost-bitten crops and icy patches that appeared overnight, impervious to sun or thaw. It was as if the child's presence extended beyond walls, bending nature itself to an unspoken will. Jacob Forsyth documented these changes with obsessive precision. He noted that the child, though confined to his nursery, seemed to influence conditions miles away. The wind carried whispers that seemed to originate in the fields, chilling travelers' faces as they passed. Livestock refused to graze, finding themselves unnaturally stiff and wary, retreating at a subtle, unseen command. Abigail Forsyth observed frost patterns forming in doorways and around windowsills, often mirroring shapes from her son's unremarkable nursery, as though a silent message had been etched into the frozen earth. A local farmer, Benjamin Cole, ventured near the fields during a brief thaw, reporting shadows that moved independently of the trees and the faintest sound of a child's voice repeating his own name. Horses he had brought with him refused to step forward, ears flattened, eyes wide with terror. Cole abandoned his task and fled, claiming that the child's influence extended into thought itself, guiding fear into the mind. Villagers whispered that anyone entering the fields risked vanishing like the servants and travelers before them, drawn into the frost-bitten land by something unseen. The child's effect was not merely environmental. Jacob's journals recorded a sequence of oddities. Frozen puddles where none had formed, plants encased in ice despite warmth, and faint skeletal footprints leading from the nursery window to the fields, vanishing as though swallowed by the frost. Shadows stretched and bent in ways impossible under natural light, forming shapes that suggested small, silent watchers accompanying the child's every movement. Abigail noticed her son would sometimes track patterns in the frost from his crib, staring as though the frozen designs whispered secrets only he could understand. By late winter, the fields had become a warning, a visual echo of the child's growing, terrifying power. The snow and ice themselves seemed to hold a memory of his influence, recording in frozen form every fearful step, every whisper, every shadow. The townspeople, already wary, avoided the area entirely, leaving the Forsyth home isolated amid an unnatural, frozen expanse. Those who dared approach reported shivers that were not caused by cold alone, as if the land itself exhaled dread. Would you have crossed the frost-bitten fields, knowing what they concealed? By early 1847, the Forsyth property had become a place where night itself seemed hostile. Villagers reported a new phenomenon, howls that echoed across the frozen fields and creek banks, a sound neither entirely human nor entirely animal. The wails would begin softly, almost mournfully, then crescendo into ear-piercing shrieks that could be heard for miles. Travelers passing the area fled in terror, some claiming the sounds carried their names, calling them to the edge of sanity. Jacob Forsyth recorded these occurrences with painstaking care. He observed that the howls coincided with the child's most extended periods of silence, as if his quiet observation summoned the sounds. Candles inside the house flickered and guttered, doors rattled in their frames, and shadows danced wildly along walls and ceilings. Abigail, clutching the child, noted that he remained seemingly unaware, yet the room's atmosphere trembled with the intensity of the noises. Servants huddled together, whispering prayers they did not believe, their eyes darting toward corners that seemed to pulse with movement. One night, Harlan, the old man across the creek, attempted to investigate. Wrapped in heavy coats, he approached the source of the noise, the blue moonlight illuminating frostbitten patterns in the snow. As he neared the Forsyth home, the howling grew louder, seemingly circling him. Shadows stretched unnaturally, coiling around trees, rocks, and the edges of the creek. Harlan later recounted that the sound penetrated his very chest, vibrating through bone and mind alike. He fled, breathless and trembling, swearing that the child was at the center of it all, directing forces unseen with uncanny precision. Reports from villagers multiplied, livestock panicked, dogs barked at empty fields, and cats disappeared for days, returning with fur singed and eyes wide with fear. Even travelers who avoided the property reported hearing the howling from miles away, carried on the wind in ways that defied logic. The sound was not merely an echo of nature, but a manifestation of something deliberate, a force tied inexorably to the Forsyth child. Jacob's journals described the culmination of these nightly events as terrifyingly precise. The howling seemed to align with deaths, disappearances, and sudden illnesses. It was as if each wail carried a warning or marked a claim, a subtle but unstoppable influence exerted through sound. Abigail's maternal fear deepened, knowing their son's silence could produce chaos far beyond the house. By spring, the howling had become another layer of the Forsyth curse, a chilling reminder to all who heard it that the child's power was inescapable. Would you have dared stay inside that house through the night, listening to those cries? In the deep chill of January 1847, a stranger named Elias Cartwright arrived in Forsyth, seeking shelter and work. He had heard rumors of the Forsyth child but dismissed them as superstition, tales exaggerated by frightened villagers. Cartwright, a rugged man accustomed to harsh winters, approached the homestead with cautious confidence. Yet as he crossed the frozen fields, a creeping cold seemed to penetrate his bones, sharper than any frost he had ever felt. Jacob Forsyth welcomed the visitor warily, observing his every movement. Abigail, holding the child, sensed a disturbance in the air, a subtle shift that raised the hairs on her arms. The child, as if sensing the newcomer's skepticism, fixated on him, eyes unblinking, gaze unnervingly precise. That night, the house itself seemed to react. Frost patterns formed along windows and floorboards, swirling toward the visitors' quarters as though the cold had intent. Shadows lengthened and bent, reaching for corners of the room that should have remained dark and empty. Cartwright documented his unease, noting whispers that seemed to come from walls and ceilings, murmuring in tones both human and inhuman. Candles flared violently as he attempted to read by their light, extinguishing abruptly in moments of heightened silence. The air pressed heavily against him, making each breath a conscious effort. He sensed movement in spaces where no one existed, a subtle observation that unsettled even his rational mind. The child's presence permeated the house, quiet and potent, commanding the environment without motion or sound. By the third night, Cartwright had begun to succumb. He awoke to find frost encasing his clothing and bedding, patterns forming shapes that resembled small figures reaching toward him. The whispers intensified, now repeating his own name in soft, deliberate tones. Attempts to leave were met with unseen resistance. Doors would not open, steps faltered, and shadows seemed to crowd the hallways. The visitor's robust frame shivered violently, each moment a struggle against forces beyond comprehension. By dawn, Cartwright vanished. Servants found only a trail of frost leading from his room into the fields, ending abruptly, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Jacob recorded the event in his journals with growing horror, realizing the child's influence now extended fully beyond the home. Abigail, clutching the infant, feared for anyone who came near, understanding that their son's power could bend not only perception but reality itself. The Forsyth homestead had become a crucible of dread, and the frostbitten visitor became yet another testament to the inescapable force surrounding the child. Would you have dared enter those rooms knowing what had befallen Cartwright? By early spring 1847, fear had gripped Forsyth entirely. Villagers convened in the town hall, a modest building now heavy with whispered dread, to discuss the child's influence and the mounting disappearances. Faces were pale, eyes wide with unease, hands fidgeting as each witness recounted tales of shadows, whispers, frost, and inexplicable vanishings. Even the most skeptical attendees could no longer dismiss the Forsyth curse as mere superstition. Thomas Hargrove, a local blacksmith, described how his horse bolted upon crossing the Forsyth fields, panic in its eyes despite clear paths and calm winds. Martha Dunlap, a baker, recounted servants disappearing from her acquaintance, returning only days later shaken, speaking in disjointed phrases, eyes haunted. The room itself seemed to respond to these confessions, a chill lingering, the wooden floors groaning softly under an invisible weight. Each story amplified the growing unease, a subtle, communal recognition that the Forsyth child was at the center of something beyond mortal comprehension. Jacob Forsyth, summoned reluctantly, attempted to defend his family. He spoke of an innocent child, unaware of the power that radiated from him, of his own efforts to shield neighbors from harm. Abigail, standing quietly beside him, felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Yet even she sensed that the child's influence extended beyond control, bending perception, events, and nature itself. As Jacob pleaded, a faint murmur rose from the crowd. Whispers not entirely human, faint and deliberate, causing several villagers to shiver involuntarily. The debate escalated. Some proposed confronting the family. Others recommended leaving the Sainte area entirely. A few argued for more rational investigation, despite the mounting evidence of the child's power. As the meeting reached tense heights, an icy gust swept through the hall, extinguishing the candles. Shadows flickered along walls, forming shapes that seemed to mimic the attendees, and a soft, haunting giggle echoed, a sound that froze every heart in the room. The villagers realized with stark clarity that the child's influence had breached the home, touching minds and bodies even within the safety of the hall. By nightfall, the meeting adjourned without resolution. Fear had overtaken reason. Travelers and townspeople now spoke openly of the Forsyth curse, reinforcing its inevitability. The child's silent power, documented meticulously by Jacob, had become undeniable, reshaping the village's sense of safety and morality. Each attendee left haunted, contemplating the invisible threads that connected the infant's gaze to the world around him. The Forsyth home was no longer merely a dwelling. It was the epicenter of dread, and the village a witness to its inexorable influence. Would you have attended that meeting, knowing the child's silent reach could touch you even there? By late spring 1847, the Forsyth lands were frequently shrouded in an unnatural fog. Thick and clinging, it crept across the fields and the creek with an almost sentient will, chilling the bones of anyone unfortunate enough to wander near. The fog carried with it faint whispers, snippets of conversation, and fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished as soon as they were seen. Villagers quickly learned to avoid the area entirely, speaking in hushed tones about the child at the center of it all. Jacob Forsyth, documenting the phenomenon in his journals, noted that the fog often appeared when the child was unusually quiet. Candles in the home flickered violently when the mist pressed a gate. Windows and shadows inside the house lengthened in unnatural directions, reaching toward corners no human could occupy. Abigail, ever watchful, sensed that the child's unblinking gaze was somehow directing the fog, guiding it with subtle, inexplicable precision. Animals shied away from open fields, horses rearing and dogs retreating into the home, whimpering as though aware of the unseen danger outside. A local hunter, Samuel Pike, attempted to navigate the fog to check on his traps. He described the experience as being swallowed by a living presence, the mist pressing against him with intent, forming indistinct shapes that seemed to follow every movement. He reported hearing soft laughter, a sound that carried across the frozen earth and chilled him to the bone. By the time he emerged from the fog, Pike was disoriented, trembling, and convinced that the child was at the center of the phenomenon, controlling both mist and perception with eerie precision. Jacob recorded further observations. Footprints would appear in the fog, leading toward the house and vanishing mid-path. Ice and frost seemed to form inside the mist, despite warm temperatures, and faint, cold gusts seemed to emanate from the child himself. Abigail noticed patterns in the fog, swirling formations that mimicked shapes from her son's crib, as though reality itself bent to his influence. The townspeople, already fearful from previous disappearances and spectral events, now recognized the fog as a physical manifestation of the child's power. By the following month, the fog had become another symbol of inevitability and dread. Those who entered it often returned shaken, sometimes with fleeting glimpses of the child at the center of the swirling mist, his eyes unblinking, silent and commanding. Even the bravest souls acknowledged that the Forsyth property had become a nexus of supernatural fear, and that the child's influence could reach far beyond the walls of the house. Would you have dared cross the icy fog? No. Wing, what had happened to those who tried before you? By mid-1847, the Forsyth curse began to claim victims beyond the homestead. Jonathan Reed, a respected neighbor who lived a mile from the property, vanished without warning one morning. His wife reported he had gone to inspect a fence near the edge of the Forsyth fields and never returned. The search party found only a trail of frost leading toward the child's home, vanishing mid-path. No struggle, no footprints beyond that point, only the chilling stillness of the snow. Jacob Forsyth recorded the disappearance with a mixture of dread and meticulous precision. He noted that the child had been unusually quiet that morning, gazing out of his nursery window for hours. Abigail observed the boy's unblinking eyes following movements outside, fixed on the edge of the frozen fields where Jonathan Reed had been last seen. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation, shadows stretching toward the distance as if reality itself was bending around the child's silent command. Neighbors whispered in fear and disbelief. Reed had been a robust man, rational and skeptical of previous events, yet he had succumbed to forces beyond comprehension. Villagers reported hearing soft murmurs along the Forsyth property, whispers that seemed to recount private knowledge of the missing man's life. Horses shied from the frozen fields, dogs barked at nothing, and even travelers passing the area felt an unnatural pull, a subtle urging to look toward the child's home. Abigail, increasingly fearful of her son's abilities, documented subtle behaviors, patterns in the frost forming toward the house, the whispering wind seeming to guide steps and thoughts, and shadows that twisted unnaturally in response to unseen stimuli. Jacob's journals noted that the child's influence was no longer confined to the immediate household. It had extended into the age itself, reaching minds and hearts with subtle, inexorable force. Even the most rational observers could no longer deny the correlation. By evening, Reed's absence became widely known, reinforcing the town's growing panic. The Forsyth homestead was now universally recognized as the epicenter of inexplicable vanishings, supernatural phenomena, and creeping dread. Villagers avoided the fields, the creek, and even roads within sight of the property. The child's silent power had proven capable of claiming a life without leaving a trace, a terrifying extension of control over reality itself. Would you have dared approach the Forsyth home, knowing the fate that had befallen your neighbor? In late 1847, a young itinerant merchant named Caleb Hensley became the next witness to the Forsyth curse. Traveling during an unusually harsh winter, Hensley found himself stranded in a blizzard near the edge of the Forsyth property. Snow fell relentlessly, covering the fields in thick, unbroken drifts, and the icy wind seemed to carry murmurs, faint whispers that beckoned him forward. Desperate for shelter, he approached the homestead, unaware of the silent, malevolent presence within. Jacob Forsyth, documenting the event meticulously in his journals, observed Hensley's approach from a distance. Abigail clutched the child tightly, sensing the stranger's intrusion, as though the house itself had grown alert. The child's eyes, unblinking and fixed, followed Hensley's movements, and Jacob noted the subtle distortion of the air around the man, a bending of light and shadow that made the snow appear to ripple unnaturally. Animals nearby, horses, dogs, even birds, fled or refused to approach, sensing a force beyond the ordinary. Inside the house, the atmosphere thickened, candles flickered wildly despite the absence of draught, and the wooden floors groaned under invisible weight. Hensley entered cautiously, seeking warmth and refuge, yet each step seemed guided by unseen hands. He reported a cold that penetrated to the bone, a heaviness, as in the chest, and shadows that twisted at the edge of his vision. Whispers grew louder, repeating fragments of his own thoughts, his fears, and secrets he had never shared aloud. The child remained silent, seated in his crib, eyes fixed on the intruder, and yet the room pulsed with his influence. Hensley attempted to leave the following morning, only to find the snow outside disturbed in unnatural patterns, frozen spirals and footprints leading toward the fields, vanishing mid-path. The wind carried soft laughter, chilling and deliberate. He barely escaped, recounting to villagers the sensation of being observed, hunted, and directed by a force he could neither see nor comprehend. Jacob noted that the child's power had again extended beyond the home, reaching even those who approached with rational intent. By the end of winter, the snowbound witness became a cautionary tale. Villagers understood that the Forsyth child's silent gaze could manipulate reality itself, bending perception, controlling the environment, and reaching even outsiders drawn to the homestead. The snow-covered fields, once simple landscapes, had become instruments of dread, a medium through which the child's influence manifested. Would you have dared cross those snowbound fields, knowing the fate that awaited Hensley? By the spring of 1848, the creek that wound past the Forsyth property had become another instrument of fear. What had once been a modest waterway now froze at inexplicable intervals, even during thawing temperatures. The ice formed thick and unyielding, spreading across the creek bed with unnatural patterns, creating sharp ridges and jagged spirals. Locals whispered that the child's presence had extended to the water, freezing its flow and bending reality along its edges. Jacob Forsyth recorded meticulous observations. He noted that when the child sat quietly in the nursery, the froze, and creek exhibited sudden fissures, patterns that seemed to align with shadows in the home. Abigail observed that the child often followed the creek with his gaze, even from indoors, eyes fixed and unblinking. The ice seemed to respond to his focus, shifting subtly under moonlight, reflecting patterns that suggested movement, watching, waiting. Servants and animals alike recoiled from the area, their instincts warning them that the frozen creek had become unnatural, even alive. A passing fisherman, Elias Thorne, described an encounter he could not explain. Attempting to fish from the creek bank, he noticed the ice shimmer with faint blue luminescence. As he approached, he heard whispers, soft, deliberate, repeating fragments of his life. Shadows along the banks twisted toward him, elongating unnaturally. He tried to leave, but stumbled on ice ridges that seemed to rise from nowhere, forcing him to retreat in terror. By the time he returned to town, his face was pale, his hands trembling, and he swore the child's gaze had drawn him closer to the frozen water. Jacob's journals further detailed the creek's patterns, intricate frost designs extending into the water, spiraling outward like a web, ice fractures that appeared only when observers approached, and subtle distortions of sound, wind, and shadow surrounding the child's home. Abigail noticed that the frozen creek sometimes seemed to echo movements from the nursery, as if a reflection of the child's presence had imprinted itself upon the landscape itself. The villagers now regarded the creek as an extension of the homestead's curse, a tangible manifestation of the child's growing, silent power. By late spring, no one approached the creek after dusk. Even during the day, travelers stayed far from its banks, leaving the icy waterway eerily undisturbed. The Forsyth child had transformed a simple creek into a locus of supernatural influence, a silent yet undeniable warning of the reach and inevitability of his presence. Would you have dared cross its frozen expanse, knowing what it concealed? By the summer of 1848, strange lights began appearing around the Forsyth property. Villagers spoke of a lantern glowing faintly in the distance, moving without any visible hand to carry it. It was never bright, only a dim, bluish glow that seemed to float, weaving between trees and along the edges of the frost-bitten fields. Its presence unnerved anyone who saw it. The faint illumination carried with it a profound sense of anticipation, as though something unseen was waiting. Jacob Forsyth documented these occurrences meticulously. He noted that the lantern appeared exclusively at night, always when the child was still and silent. Abigail observed the child's eyes following its path, unblinking and fixed, as if he had summoned it. The servants, few who remained, refused to leave the house after sunset, whispering of flickers at windows and shadows that stretched unnaturally toward the light. The child's influence was undeniable, bending both perception and the natural environment to his quiet will. One night, a wandering merchant named Peter Langley attempted to investigate the lantern. He followed its meandering glow through the fields, snow crunching underfoot despite the warmth of the season. As he approached, shadows deepened and lengthened, moving independently of trees and fence posts. Whispers floated on the air, repeating his name in soft, deliberate tones. Suddenly the lantern's glow shifted toward him, flickering violently as though reacting to his approach. Peter fled in terror, but he later reported the faintest trace of light lingering even after he had left the area, a haunting reminder of the child's reach. Jacob recorded further observations. The lantern never appeared in the same place twice, yet its path always converged on the house. Frost patterns and broken branches suggested subtle manipulations of the terrain, aligned with the child's gaze. Abigail noted that the child sometimes followed the lantern's movement with quiet fascination, eyes fixed, breathing slow and deliberate. The villagers grew increasingly fearful, convinced that the lantern was a marker of events yet to come, an omen tied to the child's growing, inexplicable power. By late summer, the midnight lantern became another symbol of dread. Villagers and travelers alike avoided the Forsyth property entirely after dusk, leaving the house isolated amid shadow and whisper. The child's silent, unblinking presence had transformed the homestead into a place where light itself obeyed his unseen command. Would you have dared follow that lantern into the night, knowing what had befallen those who tried before you? By autumn of 1848, the Forsyth homestead began exhibiting an alarming new phenomenon. Windows shattering spontaneously without cause or impact. Villagers spoke of hearing sudden cracks in the dead of night, glass splintering inward and outward simultaneously, shards littering the floors in intricate, almost deliberate patterns. These events occurred at intervals, often coinciding with periods when the child was unnervingly quiet, staring unblinking from his nursery. Jacob Forsyth meticulously documented each occurrence. He observed that the windows most affected faced the fields and creek, places already marked by frost, fog, and unnatural events. Abigail noticed subtle signs preceding the shattering, a sudden chill, a faint vibration in the air, and shadows twisting along walls. Even the remaining servants, hardened by months of exposure to the child's power, refused to enter rooms where the phenomenon had recently occurred. The household was growing increasingly isolated as fear and anticipation became constant companions. One evening, a traveling preacher, Reverend Whitmore, arrived at the homestead seeking refuge. He witnessed a window shatter mere moments after he entered the room. The sound was deafening, yet no object had struck the glass. He described shards forming delicate web-like structures on the floor, reflecting moonlight in ways that seemed purposeful. He fled the house trembling, convinced the child's presence was capable of manipulating physical reality, bending even glass to his silent will. Jacob's journals suggested a link between the shattered windows and previous supernatural events. Patterns in frost, whispers on the wind, and sudden vanishings all seemed to correlate with these violent outbursts. Abigail began to understand that the child's unblinking gaze was not merely passive, it actively influenced the world around him, bending objects, nature, and perception to a silent, unstoppable force. Shadows lengthened and coiled near the windows, as though the house itself had become an extension of the child's influence. By the end of autumn, the Forsyth home was a place of palpable tension. Every window, every shadow, every flicker of light had become a potential site of terror. The villagers avoided even looking at the house directly, aware that the child's power extended far beyond the nursery. The shattered windows stood as a stark reminder that no space was safe, that reality itself could bend to the will of the silent child. Would you have dared enter those rooms, knowing that even glass might betray you without warning? By late 1848, the Forsyth home had become a symphony of unexplained sounds. Among the most unnerving were the echoing footsteps that began to fill the hallways at night. Heavy or light, rapid or deliberate, the sounds seemed to move through walls and floors with a logic that defied human presence. Servants who attempted to follow the noise found empty corridors and rooms, the sound seemingly retreating just ahead of their steps. Jacob Forsyth noted the correlation between these nocturnal footsteps and the child's periods of silence. The infant would lie in his crib, eyes unblinking, yet the entire house seemed to respond to his mere observation. Abigail, holding the child close, sensed a subtle vibration in the air, a pulse that preceded each echo, as if the home itself were alive and moving in rhythm with the child's will. Animals cowered, retreating to corners of the house, ears flattened, trembling as if aware that each step carried a hidden purpose. One evening, a neighbor named Martha Lindell, who had been dared by local youths to witness the Forsyth home's strange events, entered the house. The echoes began almost immediately, footsteps circling above her, below and alongside, yet no one appeared. She reported hearing whispers accompanying the movement, faint and fragmented, repeating parts of her own life aloud. Shadows stretched across walls in time with the sounds, forming shapes that seemed almost human, yet impossibly distorted. By the time she fled, her mind was fraught with terror, leaving her unable to speak of what she had experienced without shaking. Jacob documented further phenomena. Footsteps that began in the nursery, descended the stairs and vanished into walls, a sound pattern that repeated even in empty rooms, and vibrations that could be felt through floors and ceilings, detectable even to those who had not witnessed the origin. Abigail realized that the child's influence extended beyond physical manipulation. These echoes were both auditory and psychic, resonating in the minds of anyone nearby. By the close of 1848, the echoing footsteps had become an expected, haunting feature of the Forsyth home. Villagers whispered that the house had become a living instrument of the child's silent power, capable of commanding fear, anticipation, and dread. Each night, the echoes reminded all who approached that the child's influence was inescapable. The house had transformed into a domain where presence, sound, and shadow were dictated by a single, unblinking gaze. Would you have dared walk those halls knowing every step could be followed by an invisible force? By 1849, the Forsyth homestead stood nearly abandoned, a silent sentinel to the events that had unfolded within and around its walls. The villagers, now fully aware of the child's extraordinary influence, avoided the property entirely. Stories of vanishings, frost, fog, shattered windows, and echoing footsteps had spread beyond the town, growing in intensity with each retelling. Jacob and Abigail Forsyth remained, bound to their son, yet aware that he had transformed the home into something neither fully human nor entirely natural. Jacob's journals became a chronicle of dread and inevitability. Each page recorded meticulous observations of the child's abilities, detailing patterns of frost on fields, frozen creeks, whispering winds, and the spectral lanterns that moved without hand. Abigail, ever protective, noted her son's unblinking gaze, a presence that commanded attention and submission. Together they witnessed the child's influence expand beyond walls, fields, and even the frozen creek, affecting anyone who dared to come near. The Forsyth legacy was no longer a mere family name. It had become synonymous with inexplicable fear, a power both silent and omnipresent. The remaining villagers speculated endlessly on the child's nature. Was he cursed, gifted, or something entirely different? Families left the town in waves, abandoning fields, businesses, and homes, unwilling to risk contact with the Forsyth presence. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of the frost patterns, the icy fog, and the strange, deliberate vanishings. Even those who had never set foot near the homestead felt a chill when hearing the tales. Jacob and Abigail, despite love and concern, could not deny the truth. They were custodians of something extraordinary, something terrifying, something that would outlast them. By late 1849, the homestead itself had become almost a monument of fear. The house stood in quiet, brooding silence, yet the patterns in frost, the whispering winds, and the distant glimmer of spectral lights served as constant reminders that the child's influence remained. The villagers understood that even if the family were gone, the legacy, the curse, the power, was permanent, woven into the land, the air, and the memories of all who had witnessed it. The Forsyth child grew into legend, a figure whispered in warnings and tales. The homestead became a symbol of silent inevitability, a reminder that some forces cannot be controlled, only endured. Would you have remained, faced with the choice between leaving your home or submitting to the silent, unblinking power that had reshaped an entire village? The Forsyth legacy was a chilling testament. Even a single child, quiet and observant, could alter the course of generations, leaving behind a century of silent funerals and whispered fear.